And welcome. Thank you for joining us once again for another Deer Talk Now podcast. I am Dan Schmidt. We appreciate everybody, all your support, joining us, following us, liking these podcasts, subscribing to the podcast. It's all free, and we bring them to you every Thursday here at Deer and Deer Hunting. A special guest today. They're all special, but today is a very special guest, Kip Adams from the National Deer Association, their Chief Conservation Officer. Kip, thank you for joining us.
Absolutely, Dan. Good to see you, and thank you for having me on.
Absolutely. We've wanted to do this for quite a while, and we just haven't gotten to it. I'm glad to have you on here. There's so many things that I want to talk to you about because, as was the case when we had Brian Murphy on a few years ago, I know you and I could get in a room and we could talk for hours on all things deer and deer hunting. So I'm going to, without further ado, it's going to be a scattergun approach. I'm going to throw you subjects, and I think we're going to get along well here.
All right, that sounds good to me.
Okay, first one, Kip. If you guys don't know, Kip has been with, it used to be Quality Deer Management Association, now rebranded as the National Deer Association. He's been a biologist basically his whole career. He started with Penn State University, got his bachelor's degree there, got his master's from New Hampshire, joined QDMA in, I believe it was 2002. And so
Yeah.
you've got quite a few years there, and I know you also worked in the agency end of things with Florida, their game and fish department, and also New Hampshire's. Did I get this all correct?
You're spot on, Dan. That's all correct.
And I know that your specialty has been deer. We see your videos. We see all your content also on social media. Kip provides a lot of the tips that you're seeing in their day-to-day activity. But one of the things I know, Kip, you're from Pennsylvania. Penn State has done some tremendous studies. We've referenced them in Deer and Deer Hunting over the years. The first one has to do with buck dispersal, and I know you know a lot about this. But for anybody who's joining and hasn't paid attention to the research that's come out on buck dispersal, in an elevator speech, what can you tell us what you know about buck dispersal? What ages do they disperse? How often do they disperse? And lengths. Now, I know this varies throughout the country, so I know you're going to do a lot of prefacing.
Because we have GPS radio collars today, research has advanced so far in the last 1 to 2 decades. So, in a nutshell, from a dispersal end, whether you're in the Northeast, Midwest, Southeast, universities all over the whitetails range have found very similar results. And essentially, half to 3/4 of those yearling bucks, or those bucks that are 12 to 18 months old, half to 3/4 of them are going to disperse 1 to 5 miles away from where they were born. So they're gonna leave and go a long way. Of those that disperse, about 1/4 of them will disperse in the springtime, because when the doe is having the next fawn, she kicks Junior out, he's gone. And about 3/4 of them end up kind of hanging around a little bit with mom, but then they get kicked out that next fall when she's ready to breed again. So half to 3/4 are going to leave, and they're going to go 1 to 5 miles away. So a lot of intermixing out there with our deer herds.
So one of the questions I get a lot from people is, what about the other 25 to 50%?
Those ones stay, and they tend to not disperse. And a lot of those, what we find through research is that those are ones who were orphaned, or in large part, meaning the mother was harvested during deer season, she was hit by a car, because it's that maternal aggression that kicks them out and makes them disperse. And if that aggression is not there, hence the mother's gone, those ones are more likely to stay right where they are and just develop their home range where they were born and live the rest of their lives right in that general area.
So that's what we see, and I know it's similar where you're at, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin here, Michigan, where you have very high deer populations, and you have some guys will bring you those trail camera photos, and lo and behold, they've tracked some of these deer over the course of several years. Do you see anything with, and I'm talking about the research that you've studied, do you see anything on, do those home ranges, do they change over time? Do they become smaller? I know their core areas do, but just their general home ranges.
There's some really neat research out now with home ranges. And, we used to say that an adult buck has a home range of about a square mile. Does tend to be a little smaller. And you know what? In general, that still holds pretty true. However, we're realizing there's a lot more variability to that. And every deer is an individual. Some bucks tend to have bigger home ranges than others. And it's really not related to age. Some younger bucks have small home ranges and some have larger. Some older bucks have small home ranges, some have larger. And then within that, some tend to travel a lot on a daily basis and some travel less. And trying to tease through all that, Dan, and I am a lifelong hunter. I like to take things from research and put it in because it then helps me get the closest to deer in the fall. It helps me do the best job then being able to share this with others to help them. So the way I think about it is, all right, we know that deer are individuals. That's why on some trail cameras, you get pictures of an individual buck over and over and over again. And others, you get once a month or maybe once a season. But with respect to home range, still that square mile outside of Texas is still pretty standard. That's about what it is. But we know way more about how they use that today, how move throughout that. We know that many bucks today actually, or they spend half of the time in one segment of it and then another half of the year over in the other segment. So what I try to relate to people from that is we know about how much land they're covering, which is quite extensive. What always holds true, though, regardless of where you is that they travel a lot more during the pre-rut and then during the rut than at any other time of the year. So that's information now we can use, from a hunting end. And we also know that the actual core area, so the home range is basically where you can find a deer 95% of the time he or she is within this area. The core area is a much smaller area where we can find that deer 50% of the time, meaning it's not as likely they're going to be there, but those areas are much smaller. From a hunting end, that's where we can really start to use that because say a buck may have a home range of about square mile or 640 acres. That core area during the summer, it's only about 50 acres. During the pre-rut or before we get into the hunting season, it's still pretty small. So that is the kind of information we can use to try to start targeting a certain deer or to enhance habitat to really, encourage deer to use a certain area. So I tell people, don't worry as much about a home range, the whole size of it. Just understand that that's going to shift seasonally and they use much smaller areas that we can influence through good habitat work at certain times of the year. And those are the types of information or pieces that we can use as hunters to our advantage.
And that is some great information. And, we see some guys, especially if you guys are on YouTube, you see some guys that are just tremendous hunters who have really figured this out, especially for their properties. Let's get back to just dispersal research. Has anything changed in the scientific realm on distances? Because I know back in the day, this is going back, I want to say 1992. I could be wrong about that. There was a study out of Illinois that basically said farmland deer their dispersal distances varied, just like it did here in the North Woods where dispersal distance is varied. Has that changed, and has modern management practices have affected that at all?
Well, that has not changed all that much. It's changed a little, in large part because of just better technology with the radio collars today. In the past, this deer would get far enough away from the old collars, you couldn't find them, through the old antennas, and you just thought, well, it's just hidden somewhere, we don't see it. Well, now we know that joker could have been 20 miles away, and you wouldn't have found it with old technology, but with GPS technology, we can. The study that you're referencing, yes, in the Midwest and in more agricultural areas, those deer tend to disperse farther because it's farther between bigger blocks of cover. So the range that I said, average, 1 to 5 miles, the larger end of that tend to be in more open areas and more agricultural areas. The heavier forested areas, those deer often didn't go as far. So with what we know today, it has changed a little from that study only because we have better technology to pick up every single deer with every mile that they would go. So we're able to pick up some of those even longer range movements, like the deer there, from Louisiana, Mississippi, that literally was swimming the Mississippi River, and going a long ways away. In the past, we wouldn't have known where that deer went. Today, we can actually very accurately capture that data.
That's awesome, and that was my next question. Was I know that it varies for if you're talking about Illinois and Missouri and Iowa because it's a different topography. But now you get into places like Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and let's talk about Florida for a little bit because I know that you spent some time there. Are those trends pretty much the same in those states?
They are. And the trend within a given state is pretty similar today as the past because, those cover types aren't changing all that much. If you've been pretty forested, well, you're most likely still pretty forested today. So deer herds in large part aren't vastly different number wise from before today. The one big difference is just, there's more older bucks on the landscape today than ever before. That has the ability to change that a little bit, but not much. So that'd be pretty fine scale or very subtle difference in dispersal. So most deer managers today are still using in 10 to 20 years, and still they can confirm those data, and that's what folks are still using as a guide to try to understand how far these deer are going. Most of the actual dispersal work today is in the name of disease management, just trying to fine scale, understand a little more about where deer may spread. Some of that is just distance they're going. Other of that, though, is looking at how they're navigating the landscape relative to our, mountain ridges, are they a barrier? Our, interstates, are they a barrier? So we're still getting some data relative to movements and dispersal. But most of the studies today, that's looking more at actual use of the landscape, home range size, and that as opposed to just straight dispersal, because that one is holding pretty constant.
What about what effect has, because we talk about maternal aggression a lot. We've reported on it a lot. John Ozoga has written some just absolutely fascinating articles on that. And if you would compare doe age structure today to 1985, I'm going to say is probably a lot different because in 1985, you just didn't kill does. I don't care where you lived. That was a sacred cow. Now you go across country where you're sitting, you guys are hammering the antlerless segment. They killed over 300,000 antlerless deer last year. How does that affect buck dispersal?
That one's not affecting it a whole lot because the whether that doe is 1.5 or 5.5, the maternal aggression that next year is going to be very similar.
Wow.
So the actual age structure of the does won't change that a whole bunch. And you know what? You're right. In 85, we were shooting fewer does. Age structure was very old, but it is amazing today, even in places like Pennsylvania, where they shoot more antlerless deer per square mile than every other state. It is crazy how the advanced age structure still maintains today. It's not as old as it was in 85, but it is still a lot of fully mature deer, or fully mature antlerless deer in the landscape. And I'll share an anecdote where I am, and what you can see behind me, that's part of our north central Pennsylvania farm. For the last 20 plus years, we record every deer we shoot on our farm. We pull jawbones to age them, we weigh them, lactation status, everything. So the last 300 deer that we've shot, and I looked at this recently, for the last 20 years, for every antlered buck that we shoot about 5 antlerless deer, 4.5 to 5. We really, really get after them on our farm. Even with that, Dan, in the last 5 years, I shot a doe that Semenomanuli age, so the most accurate way to do this, aged 13.5 years old. My daughter shot a doe with a rifle, aged 13.5 years old. My son shot a doe that aged 14.5, and another one of our senior camp members shot a doe with a rifle. This is almost 10 years ago now, that aged 15.5. They all blew my mind because we get after them so hard that the average age of the does that we shoot is far younger. It's in that probably 3.5-year-old range because we harvest them so aggressively. But even then, to see that there are multiple does still getting into these advanced age classes just blows my mind at the survivability of these animals.
That is amazing. I would have never guessed that. Now, I've heard anecdotes, and I've heard people send in the tooths. It's a lab in Iowa where most of the guys I know send theirs, and they're getting back deer like that, but not off of one farm, and certainly not in a state mostly in a state that's hunted as heavily as yours. That's fascinating stuff. Deer Talk Now is brought to you by Wildlife Research Center and the new Golden Rope Scent Rope Kit. The kit comes with 4 ounces of Golden Rope Scent Concentrate, 3 cable ties, and 3 scent ropes made of proprietary fibers meant to absorb the maximum amount of scent. Simply saturate the rope in your scent of choice, hang it from a branch, and watch the trail cam photos come flying in. For more information, go to wildlife.com. Okay, let's switch gears. I could talk to you all day on this, Kip, but I've got several more topics here. The second one, I know you do a lot of this on your social media, and a lot of people are interested in it. It has to do with forest habitat, specifically invasive species. And this is actually a question I got from a guy that follows me on Twitter. I'm always going to call it Twitter. I know it's X. Is there anything I can really do to help the forest with invasives, or is it just a losing proposition? And what he means by this is in some states, like I said, it doesn't matter where you're at. If it's southern kudzu or whatever, if it's up here, it's buckthorn. I don't know what you guys have there. Can a guy really do something short of having deep pockets and a lot of resources?
That's a great question, and it absolutely. And you're right. Wherever you are in the whitetails range as a hunter, if you're managing habitat at all, you're dealing with invasives. You know, the Southeast is just covered with all kinds. But you know what? In the Northeast and Midwest, we got our share as well. We have buckthorn here, a lot of autumn olive, multiflora rose, blue, kinds of stuff. So what I tell people is you absolutely can make a difference. You're not going to kill it all. So don't go into it with that attitude, because then you just get overwhelmed. But every single day that you go and enhance habitat and kill some of that, you've made a difference. And I like to help with our farm, break our farm up into smaller blocks, that we're going to whether either use prescribed fire on or do forest stand improvement on, whatever it is. If you look at a place in totality, you just are immediately overwhelmed. Break it into smaller chunks and let's go attack chunk by chunk. So if you want to talk buckthorn, autumn olive, honeysuckle, that's all kind of in that same realm. We kill them year round on us. We cut them, we spray them, we burn them, and we will never, ever get rid of all of them. But this year, our farm has fewer of them than it did last year. And last year, it had fewer of them than the year before. So we absolutely make a difference. And it really was that change in mindset, Dan, to understand that I can't get them all. But if I choose to do nothing, it's going to continue to get worse. And I'm not going to let that happen. So we keep at it. And I think every single person who manages habitat can do that same thing. Even if it's just half a day and a weekend once a year, that's going to be better. The more time and effort you can put in makes it even better. You don't have to have deep pockets and hire somebody to do it. There are things that every land manager can do, starting now, with different blocks, to help start removing those invasives and give plants that are better for deer and other wildlife, a fighting chance to compete with them.
Now, I haven't done fire personally. I know you've done a lot. I know a lot of other managers have done a lot. One thing that has always stuck in my head, and I think this is the same, that would be the same, you tell me if I'm right or wrong, the same as if you went in and just did a massive clear cut. But somebody told me that when you do fire, prescribed fire, especially in a woodland area, you're going to get a brand new forest. Not like a brand new, like, oh my gosh, this was hickories when we cut it, and now it's hickories again. I mean like a brand new forest, because you don't know what's laying in that soil. Is that true?
Well, partly, but that depends on if you just use fire, that is not true. Because what happens is, you take a hardwood forest that's mature, has a canopy. But if you go and cut some of those trees and let sunlight hit the ground and then add fire in, now you have the ability to change it if you want. Maybe you don't want to change it. We have areas in our oak forest that we burn underneath that we want to maintain as they are. So there are so many different variables that you can burn under and burning conditions. That is really what influences what you end up with. But sunlight is a major component. So if you add cutting or something so that you get sunlight down, now fire has the ability to start changing things if you want. And that's all, you can direct whether you want that fire to change those or not. Most people will use fire to change because they're incorporating more herbaceous understory, which is much higher quality deer food, into those forested environments. But just fire itself doesn't change it unless you use fire outside of normal prescriptions and you literally just scorch everything. Then obviously you can change, but that's not what anybody's advising or encouraging land managers to do.
And the whole purpose of this is for natural forage, the way it should be, and natural habitat. Because I know the flip side of that argument is guys say, well, I'm not going to do anything because I don't care that that's invasive. That's good cover. Deer like that cover. What would you say to that comment?
There are certainly times that is true, and we have plants on us that are good deer cover. Oftentimes, though, there is a native plant that is just as good deer cover, but is also good deer food, where a lot of those invasives just simply are not deer food, or not good deer food. So fire can really help in those areas too, because think buckthorn, autumn olive, butch, they can be hard to cut those down, particularly when they're big. If you have the ability to run a fire through there and help knock them back, boy, when they start sprouting again, now it is super easy to walk through and be able to very quickly spray those and kill them. So not everybody can use fire. I totally get it. But if you have the ability to, that can really, really help in your fight against invasives like that. But not all invasives are bad. There's things we have here that didn't originate here that are very good for deer. Red clover, white clover, those are, native to here. They've been here, for 500 to 1,000 years. So there are examples of non-natives that are valuable, and we don't need to get rid of every single one of them. And I tell people, don't get rid of it just because it's native. Let's attack the things that are really invasive and are negatively impacting. Start with those and then just continue. I want to use more native plants, that where I can as well. But I try to do it strategically where I'm removing the invasive non-natives first and helping replace those with native plants that are better. I still have places where there's autumn olive on us, and I'm taking advantage of the cover they're providing. They're on my list to get rid of, and replace it with something else. But, as long as they're not under a hardwood forest dominating, or taking over for oak seedlings, or out in fields, where I want herbaceous stuff. If they're in a hedge, also used as a screen between fields or something, they are lower on the priority list to get rid of. I'm going to attack the ones that are, being more negatively harmful for our place first.
That's awesome. Great information. And again, if you guys want to see some videos, you got to check out Kip's videos on this. Okay, switching over, Kip, to the Fawn study that Penn State did. What we know, and Diefenbach did that, I know he helped or coordinated it. 3-year study on fawn survival yielded several surprising revelations. One of them was that between 28% and 43% of fawns will not live past 6 months of age. That surprises me. And what are some of the factors for those higher mortality rates?
Well, some of it is that there's a lot of predators, that like to eat fawns. Pennsylvania is lucky in that we have a lot of bears, we have a lot of coyotes, a lot of bobcats. So those things certainly take some. But deer, have a high reproductive rate. They're dropping a lot of fawns, and just evolutionarily, that's how they developed, knowing that, man, there's a certain percentage that just aren't going to make it anyway. And that Penn State study was a super cool study, followed up by a fawn survival study in Delaware, where there were no coyotes, no bears, very, very few bobcats. And they found that, boy, just about half of their fawns died anyway, or died too, even in the absence of those predators. So, back here, 10 to 15 years ago, there was such a big push, with the whole predation thing, as coyotes kind of invaded the Southeast. I know you've had them for a long time. We've had them forever here in Pennsylvania. But when they arrived in many new southeastern states, they really wreaked havoc on a lot of those deer herds. And large part, Dan, was there wasn't real good cover for a lot of those fawns. So if you have good cover for fawns, they certainly have a much better chance of surviving. No cover, man, it's very easy for predators to pick them off, or poor cover, I should say. But one thing that we should say too about fawns is there's a certain percentage of them that the mother is either just not healthy enough to raise them, or in many cases, she's hit by a car and they're abandoned. There's a lot of things that go on out there that unfortunately kill fawns too, besides predators. Predators get all the press because we feel as hunters like, man, if we could kill more predators, we could have
Yep.
more fawns and more deer. And in some cases, that is true, but not everywhere. Take our farm, for example, in a lot of places in Pennsylvania that have really good cover, alternative food sources for those coyotes and bears and bobcats, and they're just not eating as many fawns. So what I tell people is just because you have a lot of predators doesn't mean you have a fawn predation problem. You know, and there's a lot of research now to show that even with intensive trapping of coyotes, man, you have to do it so intensively year after year, and you take 1 year off, and the numbers are right back. You know, most people just can't maintain that. So I tell people, if you want to trap, do it. It's a lot of fun, but don't fool yourself into thinking you're making a difference from the fawn end. If you like to hunt predators, do it. I do it. It's a ton of fun, but it's not going to help with the fawns. You want to help more fawns survive, enhance habitat, give them better places to hide, and a higher percentage of them will survive.
Yeah, that's like that. To that example is taking a bucket of water out of the ocean. If you stop, ocean's back, and that trapping is got to be consistent. That much we know. One thing I found fascinating with that 3-year study, however, and I want you to touch on, is they actually were testing cortisol levels, and they said stress was one of the top factors outside of predation.
Isn't that crazy? Yeah, I mean, part of it, I think it's so cool that they're able to just test that in, wildlife now like this, and to see, what was going on. So, so that was a pretty big factor, relative to how some of those animals were dying. So I think part of that, it's pretty cool that we're at that level today, that researchers can test that. It opens up so many more possibilities, into what we can do as deer managers to do an even better job. We often think of food and cover and space, and hey, maybe there is a pressure thing, or
what would the stress level? I don't mean to cut you off. What would the stress level, like? What would the increased stress levels causes be from?
Some of that could be predation related or just predator related, but I bet you that's not all of it. I bet a lot of it can be environment. It can be temperature stress. And I say this because another study out of Delaware showed that rainfall can be very harmful to fawn survival. And even just increasing rainfall, I won't remember the exact percent, but it wasn't all that much. Basically, what the take home was, a really, really rainy spring when fawns are hitting the ground greatly elevates fawn mortality.
Wow.
So some of those stress levels, Dan, I think could be environmental related. It doesn't necessarily have to be animals. I think as hunters, we immediately think, ooh, they're stressed because coyotes or bears or something around. I bet it's even more related to temperature, precipitation, that kind of thing. Ticks may play into some of that in areas, where lots of fawns are covered with ticks. So there's probably a lot of other environmental factors that lead into that.
And I'm sure that could also go hand in hand with the health of the doe that gave birth to that fawn, because as we know, if you're in, like I said, if you extrapolate it across a region, if you have poor health does giving birth as yearlings or even fawns, the odds might be higher there too for higher losses.
Absolutely. And also just the fitness level of those does, because all does milk is similar quality. It's all very high quality, but does that are healthier are able to provide a lot more milk for those fawns. They grow faster, they're stronger. Does that aren't as healthy just can't give their fawns as much. And those fawns are more sickly, they're more, they're weaker, they don't grow as fast, much more susceptible to stress and predation for longer periods.
Okay, cool. All right, so we got 3 big ones, and I can't believe we got through it that quickly. I've got a little section here, Kip. This is especially for you. I made this especially for you. There's 5 questions, and this the title of this is called "All Things Being Equal." So and I know you're a scientist, so you John always did it to me, Bob Zaglin always done it to me. They say all things being equal. Well, these are your questions. All things being equal, number 1. At what time of day do bucks move the most?
We know that bucks, and we know this from the GPS collars, all deer are crepuscular, meaning they move the most at dawn and dusk, taking advantage of how their eyesight gives them the most advantage over predators at those times. So dawn or dusk are the highest periods. Movement data shows that movement is even a little higher at dusk. So if you only have one time a day to hunt, man, as many good mornings as I've had in the deer woods, if I could just pick one, I would pick that evening hunt because you're going to have a higher percentage of those deer moving at dusk than at any other point of the day.
Now, didn't the Penn State study also show that mature bucks move a little bit more during the middle of the day at noon?
They move more at noon during the rut more than any other time of the year. You're right. So they did show that there was that block. I think it was like, wasn't it like 11 to 2, maybe 11 a.m. to 2 p.m. or something that they had that blip. So certainly individual deer, yes, for that. Overall, more middle of the day during the rut than at any other point of the year, but it's still not as much as they're moving at dawn and dusk.
Perfect. Okay, number 2, all things being equal, what percentage of fawns will not make it past 6 months of age?
This really depends on where you are, but in general, all things being equal, somewhere around a half of them. If you are in that 6 weeks is the most critical period. Once they hit 6 weeks, they're going to be able to avoid most predators. And I often think it was just that first month. Well, if you can get them through the first 4 weeks, they're a much higher chance of surviving. But we look at fawn recruitment rates and fawn mortality studies throughout the U.S. and try to tease out differences. Some places recruit a few more fawns than others, some a little less. But in general, Dan, it's half of them aren't going to make it. If you do a good job managing habitat, you can have a little more than half do make it. If you're not doing as good from a habitat end, or maybe you have more predators or something, less than half of them are going to make it. And that's pretty common across most of the whitetails range. It's pretty surprising when most people think that, because you think a doe has twins, she's recruiting 2 in. You've heard hunters say it 1,000 times, if you shoot a doe, you're shooting 3 deer. Well, that's not true at all, because even though she may have 2 fetuses, less than 2 fetuses on average are born, and way less than 2 fawns that are born survive to the fall.
The most that I've seen normally is like a 0.3 recruitment rate, but we've seen them as high as 0.7, 0.9 in some years here. So that gives you a little bit. So if you hear that number, that's what Kip's referring to. Okay, number 3, Kip, all things being equal. We kind of talked about this. Okay. This factor kills more fawns than anything, all things being equal.
Predation is typically the highest. Some of that is just outright lots of predators. Some of it, though, that we attribute to predation is, the fawn wasn't very well nourished. It was hungry, so it was laying in its bed bleeding and just attracted the predator right to it. So, but overall, that's often the highest mortality form that we see for fawns.
And list the predators, all things being equal, from top to bottom.
Across the range, coyotes are probably number 1, just because they are present more, farther than more common than anything else. In areas where you have bears can really wreak havoc. Black bears, I'm speaking of, on fawns in areas where you have them. Bobcats, much less. They certainly get some. They're present across much of the whitetails range. So I don't know that I have seen many individual studies that show what the main predators were. Domestic dogs are always in there. But I would say, Dan, just trying to visualize all together, I would guess coyotes would by far and away have to be number 1, just because they are present in so many more areas where fawns are than even bears.
Okay, number 4, all things being equal. One thing I'd like people to know about invasive forest species is what?
I think that it's doable to enhance that. We touched on this for a minute. I think that some invasive stuff or some non-native stuff can actually be good. There's lots of those plants that actually have high quality plants. Some of them are way worse for native plants in that they outcompete them at a much higher level. I think those are the ones that we should attack first. But we need to understand that we're going to have to live with some non-native plants here for the rest of our lives, for the rest of our kids' lives. Let's understand that, but then do the best job we can as land and deer managers to attack the worst ones, to continue to enhance habitat for deer and a whole suite of other wildlife species.
Okay, and the last one, thank you. I know I'm wrapping these at you quickly. All things being equal, how many times will a buck, we talked about this, I'm just going to say it again. All things being equal, how many times will a buck disperse by the time he is 3.5 years old?
Most deer that disperse, so half to 3/4 of the bucks will disperse when they're a year to a year and a half old. Very, very few of them will ever disperse again. They are going to live within that home range. Now, that doesn't mean that they won't leave that home range and go on excursions to other areas. And there's some really neat movement data looking at excursions. Excursions are different from dispersal because dispersal is, a movement to a new area, and then that's your new home range. Excursions are very short-term vacations, think of, out of that home range. Penn State studies have showed them, lots of other studies, where these tend to be, 1 to 3 mile jaunts over the course of, a couple of days. But then they come back to the home range. And they a lot of times happen during the breeding season. So they are obviously rut related, but bucks and does do these throughout the year. So whether they're looking for new areas, maybe that they need to check out, we don't really know. But so there are excursions like that. But as far as actual dispersal, Dan, man, once they disperse that first time, the high 90% of bucks are never going to disperse again.
Perfect. Okay, Kip, thank you so much. I know that was quick and fast and furious. Where can people go to find out more information on your organization and what's all going on?
You can go to deerassociation.com. We have all kinds of information there with articles and videos, etc., to share information about a lot of the stuff that we talked about today and, anything else deer related. So we're deer hunters. We love this animal as well and like sharing information with others who want to learn more about it.
Deerassociation.com. Okay, thank you, Kip, so much. Like I said, we very much appreciate your time. It was such a pleasure to finally get you on this podcast.
All right, good to see you, Dan. Thank you very much. You have a great day.
All right, you too. Kip Adams from the National Deer Association. What a wealth of knowledge, and we really appreciate him joining us today. Again, all the Deer Talk Now episodes on the podcast platform, wherever you're listening to it, or if you want to watch it, YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, we've got it everywhere. For Kip Adams, I am Dan Schmidt. We will catch you next Thursday for another episode of Deer Talk Now. The Deer Talk Now podcast is brought to you by Mossberg, Wildlife Research Center, Traditions Firearms, Outdoor Edge Knives, Hoyt Archery, and 10 Point Crossbows.